We're continuing our study through the ages, how the Bible came to us. We'll spend a few moments here in review. Some areas of focus more than others, as some of these items we've been reviewing now for several weeks. God has revealed Himself, and we identify two classes of revelation. General revelation, that is God revealing Himself in the creation. And you see that being mentioned in the Old Testament and the New Testament. It's especially prevalent in the Psalms. We also find it in Romans chapter 1. And if you'll look at some of the sermons, even in the book of Acts, you'll see this idea of general revelation as well. God revealing Himself through the things that He has made. The other class is special revelation, which is more specific. And we have dreams and visions and angels and direct speech and what is called theophanies, special appearances of God. And these also we identify as revelation, but they give us more detail so that we can know God in a more personal way and what He expects from us. Then we noted that the Bible is inspired, accurate, and authoritative. That's actually going to come into play again today as we have some of our discussion. But inspired means that it is from God. He is the original source of Scripture. It does come through human vessels who deliver His message in a human way for a human audience, but it is from God. And even though humans are involved in the process, we have demonstrated that the Bible is also accurate. And that means that when we look at when the Bible speaks on matters scientific, it speaks accurately. When it speaks on matters of history, it speaks accurately. When it speaks prophetically, those prophecies are fulfilled according to what it says. And so we determined that the Bible is accurate. And then we said that the Bible is authoritative. And there are two aspects of this. In the one hand, the Bible speaks to us in a way that declares its authority. That the Bible speaks to us in a way that expects a response. And then we also said that if the Bible is from God and it is accurate, then it demands a hearing. So not only does it demand a hearing, but the way that the message is communicated in Scripture expects that it is to be obeyed. And so it is inspired, accurate, and authoritative. We then looked at the layout of our Bible as we have it now. And we said there are two major divisions of the Bible. We call them the Testaments, Old and New. And the word Testament is actually a reflection of the idea of covenant in this case, as in Hebrews 8:6, that Jesus enacts a better covenant. Jesus Himself says when He is partaking of the Last Supper that the cup is a representation of this new covenant in His blood. And so we have an old covenant and a new covenant. And so we have divided them in that way. Then we talked about the composition of the Bible, the languages that were used when it was being written. And we said the Old Testament is written in Hebrew with some sprinklings of Aramaic. And the New Testament is written in Greek with some sprinklings of Aramaic. And most likely that the authors of the New Testament, at least those that were Jews, their common tongue, their everyday language was Aramaic, but the common tongue of the world was Greek. And so the use of Greek in the composition of the New Testament promoted its ability to be read worldwide, which was very important. We talked about the making of ancient books. And we said that over the course of history, we have evidence of several different forms of media being used for the making of literature. Now, books are a relatively newer innovation, but mankind has been writing almost from the beginning, according to the Bible. And so we saw that some writing was on stone, some on pottery, clay, some on wood, which would have been overlaid with wax in many cases, leather, which is maybe tanned leather, but of a certain variety, and then parchment, which was often made from the papyrus reed, and ultimately vellum, prior to the modern process of paper. And vellum is a specialized treatment of leather from a specialized source that is very important to us because the majority of our New Testament manuscripts were recorded on vellum, and vellum is able to withstand quite a bit of abuse comparatively speaking, to these other forms of media. And so it's the reason that we have so much evidence for our New Testament, because it was copied onto vellum. Now, we got into some more difficult and definitely newer material in the last couple of weeks. We talked about the manuscript evidence that we have primarily for the New Testament, and we'll touch on the Old Testament today. And we looked at several new terms. Autograph means what? The original handwritten copy of a book of the Bible. Do we have any autographs today? No, we don't. And we said probably the main reason for that is almost as soon as they were made, they were being copied. And copying them over and over again means that they probably deteriorated relatively quickly. And so we don't have them. But we have copies that were made from perhaps copies of copies. So we have to trust that either humans made no mistakes, or God made sure that in spite of human error, that His truth was preserved. And we do trust that. Manuscript is a handwritten document, and all of our ancient witnesses of Old and New Testament are manuscripts, because that was the way that literature was recorded for a long time. The printing press is a new innovation. Amanuensis is a scribe, a secretarial scribe, someone who would participate in the composition of a document, and the degree of influence that they would have had over the nature of the document and the contents of the document probably depended upon who hired them. And we see evidence in the New Testament that Paul, in his letters, often identifies his amanuensis, and we can even see that in many cases, to some degree, the vocabulary that's used and the nature of the language that's used differs from amanuensis to amanuensis. But the heart of the material, of course, is Pauline, as they would say. A codex is a word for an ancient book involving a set number of columns on each page, then bound together. A majescule or uncial is a manuscript that has all capital letters. The oldest manuscripts that we possess are in all capital letters. No spaces between letters or words. And then later, the minuscule or cursive manuscripts come into being, and this is a flowing hand, and so in some ways easier to read, in some ways not, depends upon your training and the scribe in question, but almost immediately you can tell that a document must be newer if it's in cursive. Now, could a scribe, much later in history, adopt the all capital letter method? Sure. But we will not find cursive of our most ancient manuscripts. Our earliest New Testament fragment, P52, is from the Gospel of John. It's dated in the early to mid 2nd century, but our earliest complete copies of the New Testament, or nearly complete, come from the 4th century onward. Last week we talked about textual criticism. Textual criticism seeks to determine, based on evidence, what the original text of the Bible said. We talked about the principles that are used, the kinds of evidence that are used, and the certainty that textual critics have that we possess the text as God intended for us to have it. And we also said that of the more than 400,000 variants that exist in our New Testament manuscript evidence, less than 1% fall into the category of meaningful and viable. That means less than 1% of those 400,000 change the meaning of the verse or paragraph in question and show signs of possibly being original. What that means is the text of our Bible is very certain. That the very few instances where something might be different are rare. And then when we look at those, we see even if they change the meaning of the particular text in question, they don't change any doctrine, any teaching of the church. Today we're going to talk for a moment about textual criticism of the Old Testament. Last week was all about the New Testament, and the reason is there's a whole lot more discussion for the New Testament. And so rather than introducing it and then getting into a bunch of other material. I wanted to just focus on textual criticism last week. Today is all about the Old Testament. And there are people who have devoted themselves to the study of textual criticism of the Old Testament. But by and large, Old Testament textual criticism differs from New Testament criticism for one key reason. Does anybody know why or have a guess why? We're not under that law? That's a good guess. We just don't have as much manuscript evidence for the Old Testament. Well, the more manuscripts you have, the more work you have to do in comparing them. Now, does this mean that our Old Testament is less certain than our New Testament? Well, I'm going to say no, and we'll look at some reasons why that's the case. Here's what we've got, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on all of these, and that's why I've put them all on the screen at once to prevent myself from going too long. But these are the main streams of evidence that we have for the text of the Old Testament, the witnesses of the Old Testament text. They're not all in Hebrew. So we have Greek and Latin translations. I put them first, not because they're necessarily the most important, but because in many cases they are more ancient than the Hebrew manuscripts that we possess. So think about that for a moment. Some of the oldest manuscripts that we have of the Old Testament are not written in Hebrew. They're written in Latin and Greek. Does that mean that the Old Testament was composed in Latin or Greek? Clearly not. We know that these are translations that have been made from older Hebrew manuscripts. But in the science of textual criticism, a document written in the language of composition is always preferred, even if another document is older, because when you translate, you run the risk of changing the meaning, changing the nuance. And so that's why, for example, we study Greek. We can study the Bible in English and we can learn a lot, but there's some things that we learn from studying Greek. Now, let me just go ahead and tell you, it's not a magic bullet. That is a misconception. You can know very much without knowing any Greek. And just because you know Greek doesn't mean you're going to know more when we're talking about New Testament studies. The Dead Sea Scrolls. Many of us have heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. At this point, very few of us maybe were alive when they were discovered in the 1940s. But the story is told that a young man was searching for a lost animal and stumbled upon a cave and near the Dead Sea. That's why I call the Dead Sea Scrolls. And inside this cave were all of these pottery vases that have been sealed, and inside those vases were scrolls. And those scrolls contained a number of different documents. You see that second picture on the screen? A number of different documents, including commentaries on the Old Testament, including full or partial copies of books of the Old Testament in Hebrew, and these have been dated to various points in time, none as ancient as we might like. But when we compare them to other periods of time, this is where the Dead Sea Scrolls are really, really important. When we compare them and their dates to other items that we have from dates before and after them, there's incredible consistency. And so what that tells us is, and we'll talk about this in a moment, there was great care in taking to avoid mistakes by the Jews who were copying these documents. They also refer to or record all of the books that we include in our Old Testament, with the exception, I believe, of Esther. So that's pretty fascinating. The Masoretic text. The Masoretes were a group of Jews formed in the 5th century, and they were not the first to do this, but the most prolific, maybe, whose evidence of whom has survived. Their role was to ensure the faithful copying of the Old Testament. And they had some obscure rules, like if you were going to write the name of God, there was a rule about getting new ink on your pen. And they had some other strange rules that you were not allowed to, you were not allowed to copy anything by memory. that before you wrote any word, you had to refer again to the document that you were copying. Even if you had that entire book memorized, you were to keep your eyes on the copy that you were using to make a copy. And they had rules like these, and so we can see the great care that was taken in the preservation of the text. And again, these are not the first, but they're the most well known. And the Hebrew text, as we possess it today, is referred to as the Masoretic text. It is the result of the work of these Jewish scribes who were very steadfast and what we might say fastidious, close attention to detail in the copying. We also have the Talmud, which is an ancient commentary on the Old Testament. And often commentaries will print in whole or in part, in the ancient world and today, the text of the book on which they're commenting. And so the Talmud gives us ancient testimony about what at least portions of the Old Testament said. And then the Targums are similar, but they're not a bound or a volume together, but we have different Targums. So there's no one Targum, but there are many different Targums, and these are also essentially commentaries. And they're not all in the same language. We have the Syriac Targum, and we have some others. And so these also provide witnesses for us of the text of the Old Testament. Now we're going to say that, once again, the extreme care that we see throughout history, anytime we have any evidence about the ways that the Jews handled these documents and the process that they followed in copying them, that they were extremely careful, just like we mentioned the rules of the Masoretes. And so that is part of why we are so confident today about the text of our Old Testament. The other thing that I will say is, as the New Testament believers, and the evidence that we have for the New Testament, when we look at our Old Testament, it is in agreement with our New Testament. Now that's an internal argument, but as Christians that should also give us confidence. If we had documents that wildly disagreed with our New Testament, we would have to reconcile that in some way. But the Old Testament as we have it is in agreement with our New Testament. And since we are followers of the New Testament, that gives us confidence in our Old Testament. Now, a Jew can't make that argument, but Christians can. Now, let's turn the page here. We've talked about closely looking at the Old Testament text, and again, we don't have the same quantity of evidence for the Old Testament that we do for the New. But now let's begin to talk about which books belong in the Bible. Today we'll talk about which books belong in the Old Testament. Lord willing, next week we'll talk about which books belong in the New Testament. So which books belong in our Old Testament? How do we know which books belong in the Bible? Does anybody have a guess? The time they were written. Sure. Ones that show up over and over again. So they're consistently being used among believers. What else? What we do is we examine books to see if they claim or communicate in a way that indicates inspiration, accuracy, and authority. If I were to pick up a comic book, does it claim inspiration? Does it claim to be scientifically or historically accurate? Does it communicate in a way that expects obedience, inherently or expressly? No. When you read these books, do they claim to be from God more often than not? Either expressly or in an understood manner? When examined, have they proven themselves to be accurate? And do they demand a hearing? And do they expect to be obeyed? So it is not that we choose which books belong in the Bible. Rather, we recognize what God has given. And if God has given it, then it belongs. So when we talk about the word canon, because this is the word that is used when we talk about which books belong in the Bible, we're talking about the Hebrew word kanon, or the Hebrew word kane, and the Greek word kanon, from which we get the English word canon. Both of those original language words are related to a cane, like river cane. Now, why that word? Because in the ancient world, you need something to use as a standard of measurement. So you cut a piece of cane, similar to a yardstick, and it becomes your standard of measurement. And so the canon refers to a standard of measurement. Now, there is a question, and when you look at what people say about the canon, there are at least two ways that people might view the canon. They might say that the canon are books that set a standard. That is, we recognize that they are calling us to a certain form of action, or they are books that have met a standard. That means we have judged them to be worthy of inclusion. Now, in reality, it's some of both, isn't it? But we also need to say this. I don't know if I've got this. When discussing the process of canonization, we must remember that the books were considered inspired long before any lists appeared. So there are ancient lists. We'll talk about some of those in just a moment. But the books were considered inspired long before they were put on the list. But also let us say this. It is not the declaration of any man, any council of men, any so-called church that makes a book a part of the Bible. It is a recognition that God has given the book. Do you see that? Now, in particular, the Catholic Church will claim that they gave the world the Bible. But it is not up to the Catholic Church to say what belongs among the collection of books from God. The books came from God. And everyone has the opportunity to recognize whether or not those books came from Him. And their Bible includes books that our Bible does not. And we will go into more detail in a future class about the books that have been excluded. Philip asked a question last week about some of those books that we do not include, and I mentioned date. And date certainly rules out some documents. The other main criteria is simply read the books. Read the books that are in the Bible and read the books that have not been included. And you will almost immediately see that they do not speak in the same way and they don't agree. Well, either they're all fake or some of them are real and from God and those agree and some are not real. So our Old Testament canon. We mentioned before that the Old Testament in the mind of the Jews was divided into three parts. Tanakh, we called it. Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. Law, prophets, writings. And we actually see this threefold division being mentioned by Jesus in Luke 24, 44, and 45. This is Jesus speaking. He says, he's talking to the disciples on the road to Emmaus. This is when he is in his resurrection form. He's already died and been raised from the dead. And he says, "These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled." But then Luke gives us this statement. Then he opened their minds to understand the Scriptures. So what were the Scriptures prior to the New Testament? The law, the prophets, and the Psalms, or the poetic writings. So this is one representative list of the ordering of the Old Testament in the ancient world. Now, it's not the order that we have in our Bible, but we have found evidence that the Jews kept their Bible in this order. And part of this had to do with the amount of material that would fit on a scroll. So you have the law, as you would expect it. Just as in the beginning of our Bible, you've got Genesis through Deuteronomy. Usually next, they then have Joshua. Judges, Samuel, we call it 2 books. They called it 1. Kings, we call it 2. They called it 1. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then they called the minor prophets 1 book. Not because they thought that the minor prophets, the end of our Old Testament, were all from the same author, but because they fit on 1 scroll. So they called it the Book of the 12, which referred to the 12 minor prophets. They recognized the same authors that we do. Then the writings. Now this is where the ordering really is strange, perhaps, to us. But Psalms, Proverbs, you see the list there. Look at how it ends. The end of the Old Testament, what was their Bible, in the days of Jesus, was Chronicles. Now what's fascinating is we can actually see in the New Testament Jesus referring to this ordering of books. Not only in Luke 24, where he talks about the law, the prophets, and the Psalms, and it was common to refer to a document by the beginning of the document. So if you had the writings, they were headed by the Psalms. But look at this. When Jesus is criticizing the Jews, he says, the blood of Abel to Zechariah cries out. We are all familiar with Abel. Abel was the son of whom? Adam. That's found in the book of Genesis. Who is Zechariah? There are a lot of different men in the Old Testament mentioned by name. Zechariah. But there is a prophet in 2 Chronicles 24:22 who is killed by the king because he declares the word of the Lord. So what is Jesus saying to the Jews? From the beginning to the end of Scripture at that time, you've been killing the prophets. So we actually see evidence in the mouth of Jesus of this ordering. Now I'm not suggesting that we should follow this ordering. We have the important material. The ordering is not, but that sheds some light on what Jesus is saying in that moment. Now let's talk about which books are included. And I've got a few quotations from you, somewhat lengthy. A couple that I'll read for you. And I'll make a shameless plug here before I read the first one. I'm going to get this book for the church library. I don't believe we have it in the library yet. This is called Once Delivered, Forever Established, The Certainty of the Holy Scriptures. It was published by the Warren Christian Apologetics Center, named after Thomas B. Warren, a very well-known scholar in Churches of Christ in the previous century. But it's written by my former professor who was in charge of my thesis when I did my master's degree. He wrote his PhD dissertation on scribal tendencies in manuscripts. So he's very well versed in this material, and I am going to get a copy of this book for the library. Also tell you, I did see that we have a copy of this book in the library that we've referred to a few times. So that's just for you to know if you want to do some more reading. We cannot possibly include all of the material that is in these books. So I'm going to give you this quotation here from Josephus. He is a first century Jewish writer. He wrote in the mid to late portion of the first century. So this is what he said in his a letter entitled Against Apion. We also have a copy of Josephus in the library if you're interested. We, that is the Jewish people, have not myriads of books disagreeing and conflicting with one another, but only 22. Now, how many books do we count in our Old Testament? 39. But remember, they don't number them the way we number them. They count Kings and Chronicles and Samuel each as one book. They count Ezra and Nehemiah as one book. Some of them count Joshua and Judges as one book. You can see how the number 39 could be reduced. So he says, We have 22 containing the record of all time and justly accredited. Of these, 5 are the books of Moses, containing the laws and history handed down from the creation of the human race to Moses' death. This period falls a little short of 3,000 years. From the death of Moses to the time of Artaxerxes, who was king of Persia after Xerxes, the prophets who followed Moses have written down in 13 books the things that were done in their days. The remaining 4 books contain hymns to God and principles of life for human beings. From Artaxerxes to our own time, now listen to this, a detailed record has been made, but has not been thought worthy of equal credit with the earlier records, because there has not been since the exact succession of the prophets. Now what that means is Josephus in the first century is saying the books that were written in what we call the intertestamental period, the 400 years leading up to Jesus, are not inspired. This is a Jew saying this. We don't count them inspired. Those include some of the books that we don't have in our Bible, but other groups may have in theirs. Okay, that's Josephus. Now you see on the screen 2 others who are mentioned. Origen from the 3rd century, that's the 200s, and then Eusebius from the late 200s to the early 300s, 3rd and 4th century. Now, we don't have everything, or maybe even very much, of what Origen actually wrote. What we often have is quotations of Origen and other sources. And Eusebius quotes from Origen. So Eusebius gives us his understanding of the Old Testament books, but he also quotes his understanding according to Origen of the Old Testament books. So this is what, and I looked up the quotation, and it was just a little bit difficult to read, but this is the way that Origen, according to Eusebius, ordered the books. Let me make sure I'm looking at the right place here. Yeah. 1 through 5, the books of Moses. 6, Joshua. 7, Judges and Ruth. 8, the book of Samuel. That would be 1st and 2nd. 9, 1st and 2nd Kings. 10, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. 11, Ezra and Nehemiah. 12, the Psalms. 13, the Proverbs. 14, Ecclesiastes. 15, the Song of Solomon. 16, Isaiah. 17, Jeremiah and Lamentations. 18, the book of Daniel. 19, the book of Ezekiel. 20, the book of Job. 21, the book of Esther. And he forgot to say the book of the 12, which would make 22. And everyone is agreed that he did not intentionally exclude those, but he just accidentally failed to write them down. So that's Origen. Then Eusebius. This is what Eusebius says. And he's actually quoting from an even older author, Melito. And the quotation is expected to come from 170, which would be the late 2nd century. He says, when I came to the east and reached the place where these things were preached and done, and learned accurately the books of the Old Testament from a Jewish source in Palestine, I set down the facts and sent them to you. These are their names. So this is a quote-unquote Christian that's being quoted from the time of this late 2nd century. 5 books of Moses. Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. Joshua the son of Nun. Judges, Ruth. 4 books of kingdoms. That's 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. 2 books of Chronicles. The Psalms of David. The Proverbs of Solomon and his wisdom. Ecclesiastes. The Song of Songs, which is another name for Song of Solomon. Job. The prophet Isaiah, Jeremiah, and the 12 in a single book. Daniel, Ezekiel, Ezra, which would have included Nehemiah. So you look at that and you go, we have many, many ancient witnesses, not only for the books in our Bible, but exclusively for those books that we count part of our Old Testament. So the 39 books we have long been recognized as the Scriptures, even by the Jews, in as far back as our evidence goes, at least of the 1st century. Any questions or comments? I knew we had a lot of information today, and we were going to go. Yes, sir.
Does that help us? Did we gain confidence because they reported that, or did we
Yeah, so that's a great question. He says, does that give us confidence or does that help us come up with our list? So there are two matters we could discuss. One is obviously it would seem based on those quotations we read from quote unquote Christians. Understand we might not agree with everything that Origen or Eusebius said at that point in time, but we understand that they were recognizing these books. That doesn't mean we cannot examine other books. But we might ask why they didn't recognize those other books. So that gives us some information. But it also does give us confidence that the books that we recognize and exclude have long been recognized and excluded. I'll also say that the New Testament does not quote from every book of the Old Testament as we have it, but it quotes from many of the books of the Old Testament. What the New Testament does not do is quote from any of those books that we exclude, with one exception. In the book of Jude, this very short letter of Jude, he refers to information that is found in an apocryphal book or an intertestamental book called First Enoch. Now, he doesn't quote it necessarily as inspired, but he refers to information in it. Any other questions or comments? Yes, Henry. How do we determine that Genesis is accurate? So there's a degree of examination. We look at the claims that it makes. Does it claim to be from God? It does. So then we begin to examine it to see if it's accurate. Does it speak in an authoritative way? Those are the steps that we talked about. That we check its accuracy. But there's also a level of faith, isn't there? That God has given us, and we talked about this actually earlier, Sid brought it up. God has given us room to choose whether or not we're going to accept this. Because this is faith. This is not, I'm going to force anyone. I'm going to give you the opportunity to make your choice. And part of that is that this is faith rather than what we might call scientific evidence. Not that those two are in disagreement, but that they're not the same. And by the way, a lot of science requires its own kind of faith anyway. Good question. Any other questions? Yes, Alan.
I look at their scientific evidence throughout the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
So why wouldn't Genesis be?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Alan says there's scientific evidence throughout the Bible. The other thing that you'll notice is you could take a different book and you could say, this book is proven accurate, this book is proven inspired, and it testifies to this other book. Jesus quotes from Genesis. So if you believe the Jesus of the New Testament is real, and he is who he claims to be, and he's accurately been recorded, and we believe all of those things, and he quotes from Genesis, then we ought to pay attention to Genesis. So that becomes that internal evidence where we compare and contrast what we have within our Bible. All right. Well, I thank you all for your participation, and I'll see you in a few minutes.